In 2013, a committee of 9 federal officials approved a deal that gave Russia control over 20% of America's uranium production capacity. Amid rumors that the deal was linked to the Clinton Foundation, the Attorney General's office launched an investigation. The special counsel appointed to lead the probe was none other than Robert Mueller, the same special counsel who led the charge in the Russia collusion investigation. Mueller's recent benign testimony before House committees stimulated new vigor into talks about the Clintons' involvement in the Uranium One Deal. In today's America Daily, reporter Arleen Richards talks to Brad Johnson, former CIA operations officer. Johnson analyzes the connection between the Clinton Foundation and the Uranium One Deal, revival of the federal death penalty, and who in the federal government should be worried. Good morning, Arleen.
Hi, Mark.
The Uranium One Deal was big in the news some time ago. Why is it important to talk about it now?
We're bringing it up now because after Robert Mueller testified, people started sending out tweets about Uranium One again. And as you know, Mueller was the director of the FBI when the Uranium One deal was approved. People are saying he could have stopped it.
So what does that have to do with the Russia collusion investigation and Mueller's report?
Brad will give more details on the Uranium One deal, but the FBI was one of 9 federal departments that had to approve the deal. And by law, the committee is supposed to review potential national security implications. So Robert Mueller, as the head of the FBI, could have stopped the deal, but he didn't. He then became special counsel on the investigation of the deal, and of course, that was closed without any criminal charges. And one interesting point Brad makes is that this deal was leading up to the 2016 election, and the Clinton Foundation was created in preparation for that. The foundation received money from various sources, including the Uranium One deal.
Brad explains that and more. Let's listen.
There's actually been quite a little bit of reporting on it, touching on bits and pieces of this. But now keep in mind the time when this was taking place. This was all leading towards getting close to the 2016 presidential elections. So in that time and place, in history, if you will, going back those few years, everybody fully anticipated that Hillary Clinton was going to be president of the United States. And in that context, they opened up the Clinton Foundation. Now, the Clinton Foundation there were a lot of ties between other deals as well, but the uranium deal in particular stands out because of the sums of money. So basically what it was giving control, ownership over the uranium in the United States, or produced or controlled by the United States, to Russia. It was a sale of all of this stuff. So it gave control to Russia. Now, Russia doesn't have our best interests at heart. They have their own best interests at heart. So that's a strategic material used to make weapons and so on. So it's something that we would normally want to maintain control over for strategic purposes, for self-defense. So they were giving up something very important. Now, immediately on the heels of that, you saw things like more than $100 million from some of these organizations that were out involved in these Ukrainian deals from the Russia side, put over $100 million into the Clinton Foundation. So, I mean, it's long been theorized by pretty much everybody that what this was a pay to play. So, okay, we'll get you this uranium deal, but we want this amount of money. Part of that was direct deposits to the Clinton Foundation. Part of this was things like Bill Clinton going over and giving short speeches and getting, several $1 million for doing it. There were a lot of things like that taking place where people were putting large sums of money into the Clinton Foundation that had these suspicious ties back to some of these deals that had been approved by Hillary, who, of course, at that time was Secretary of State. So she was in a position, a lot of the commerce, international deals come under the control or under the authority of the Department of State. So she was in a position to move a lot of these things forward, particularly including this uranium deal. She was the one that had to push for it from the auspices of the State Department to be approved by a panel of the 9 people that had to go through, including the FBI and others, who theoretically were supposed to have done their due diligence on this deal and make sure that it wasn't tied to Putin or so on. And by the way, now, this doesn't get reported too often either, but Putin is almost certainly the richest man in the world now, and has tucked away the trillions of dollars here for his old age. So these are the types of deals he always gets a cut out of. Everybody knows, you don't do big business in Russia without Mr. Putin getting his little bit of the profit out of that. And that's how he's amassed the huge fortune that he has. So all of these things are being looked at. I don't know how in depth. I don't think it's the priority for our new U.S. Attorney General Barr. It would probably be John Durham, who's the prosecutor that he appointed to kind of look into these corruption things. But it would probably be there. But like I said, it's probably a secondary or tertiary target in the scheme of things because there's so many other things to look at.
The reason why I guess I brought it up is because not long or right after Robert Mueller gave his testimony before the House Representatives, there was a lot of buzz on Twitter about the Uranium One deal. And at that time, Robert Mueller was the special counsel and he was the FBI director. And then he became special counsel on the investigation. So what is the connection between, Robert Mueller giving this testimony recently about the Russia collusion investigation and the fact that he was special counsel on the investigation for the Uranium One deal and also FBI director when the deal was going down?
Yeah, that's a very interesting series of events connecting all of those things. So again, going back to when Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State, Mueller is director of the FBI. So he is the one that gave the approval on that 9-person panel. It is the head of 9 agencies. It wasn't a 9-person panel per se. That's misleading slightly. There were heads of agencies that had to give the approval. And I don't remember the full list of the 9. The FBI is one of them. And he is supposed to, or the FBI rather, is supposed to do their due diligence on this deal and make sure there's nothing illegal involved in all of this. Make sure it doesn't go in any way against the security interests of the United States. And that's part of the approval process for the FBI. Now, they gave approval. 90% of the uranium is now under the control of the Russians. I don't see how that's compatible with U.S. national interests. So I automatically kind of assume there's some political corruption behind the scenes there. There's something wrong. Certainly we don't know everything about it. But then as you keep going forward in time, Mueller, then he leaves. James Comey is subsequently made director of the FBI. And so you fast forward to where Trump becomes president of the United States. And kind of an interesting little twist to this is Mueller goes to President Trump and says, President Trump, I want to be the director of the FBI again now that James Comey's fired. President Trump looks at him and says, nah, I don't think so. And that was a little bit of an interesting deal because Mueller was denying that took place. And President Trump said in an interview maybe a week ago or so, he came in and asked for the job and I told him no. And if he wants to dispute it, we can drag out recordings and see what we find. And so it's been dropped as a subject. Now nobody wants to talk about that. But so just the timing of it. Mueller goes to the president of the United States, says, make me director of the FBI again. The president says, no, I don't think so. Bye. And the next day, Mueller had clearly been aware of this coming as a possibility. And the next day, he accepted the position as special counsel, heading up this commission to look at collusion, the Russian collusion. So I found that very interesting. I think he certainly went into it, plan A being try to talk his way into being the director of the FBI. And from that perspective, that position, he would certainly be able to make sure that nothing embarrassing came forward based on a uranium deal. And then probably plan B, the next best solution would then to be in this position where they're trying to take the president of the United States, off the playing board as president of the United States, or at least put enough pressure on him to basically box him in so that he can't be effective in his position, which none of that has worked. The president is really kind of run circles around everybody on that. I will say add a little side note. I mean, I think out of all of this stuff, the big loser on this whole thing is Mueller himself. And part of the problem out of this is he's been shown to be both mentally and physically, now he's becoming feeble. I think he's got Alzheimer's or senility, whatever it is. He showed a lot of infirmity in these interviews. And there's a lot of people have said, well, maybe it's a trick he's trying to play and he was doing this so he doesn't have to answer any questions. I don't think so. And let me just point out a couple little things that make me say that. One is, he would have trouble focusing and was sort of looking around and couldn't understand necessarily who was talking to him, had to ask to repeat the question many, many times to all the different people. And when he would ask these questions, he would sort of like go off and be concentrating these things, but this hand on him was trembling most of the time. And when he would go off and focus and getting questions and have to ask how to, to repeat the question, his hand still trembled, even though his concentration was clearly off on something else. And as an actor, I just don't think he's that accomplished where he would be able to maintain the facade of the trembling hand and the kind of infirmity and not being able to move the microphone very well and those things. So I just personally don't buy it. I think he just has become old and infirm, both mentally and physically, and just isn't up to it anymore. So I think his lack of focus was a representation of what he really is right now. And so I think he's the big loser because I don't think he'll be remembered for any of the things he's done in the past. I think what he'll be remembered for is this senile guy that got on the stage in front of Congress and couldn't say anything coherent, didn't give the Democrats what they wanted, and yet wouldn't clear the president either. So there's just sort of this nothing burger out there that really couldn't, keep two words in a row in order. And so it's kind of a sad in the sense that somebody who might have been remembered for bigger and better things goes down like that. But that might also ultimately be his best defense on the uranium thing. I mean, you go after some guy who's sitting looking at you and doesn't know his own name. I mean, it kind of becomes pointless at some point. If this uranium deal falls apart, yeah, he'll be toast.
That deal's not being investigated anymore, right? The FBI conducted an investigation and then they didn't file any charges against anyone.
Well, that was all done still under the Obama presidency. So I would say, it's hard to see how something untoward didn't happen. I mean, using double negative, sorry, but it almost certainly there has to be some things wrong because of the amounts of money that were being kicked into the Clinton Foundation. So, I mean, if you're talking over $100 million, that's a lot of money. Why would somebody contribute those sums of money without there being some sort of tit for tat deal? And the uranium deal was worth huge sums of money. So it would make sense to pay a $100 million bribe to have obtained that. Now, of course, they all thought Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States. So I don't think anyone was in a position to investigate her. So to have investigated and not made a charge doesn't mean that can never be looked at again. In fact, that's precisely what happened to Manafort. Manafort was looked at, investigated, no charges were brought, and then the Mueller team went back, looked at those same charges, did another investigation, and decided to charge him. So that could easily happen on this. It wasn't like they were tried and found not guilty and therefore cannot be tried again. None of that took place. My understanding is that there are elements of that being looked at. Now, I don't know any details on it, but I understand that's included. But like I said, I don't think it's a primary effort. I think it's just part of this mess that we see that's been taking place behind the scenes with the political elite.
Just a little bit more on Mueller. This testimony that he gave, there are other reports that say, and I know you're saying he seems like he's feeble and maybe has Alzheimer's. There's been other reports to say that he seemed like he was just a figurehead and he really didn't know much about the actual investigation except what was in the report. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's little question that that's accurate. He seemed really kind of unaware of the report and a lot of things that were being asked, particularly from the Republican side, he just seemed to never even have heard of. So he seemed very surprised by a lot of what was going on. And even when portions of the report were read to him, he didn't recognize them and had to be given to the page number and stuff so he could then go back and look at it again. So I don't know of anyone who would argue that he was firmly in charge of the whole thing. He may have started it out, but he hired all those people, turned it all over to them, and then was a figurehead after that. So I just don't see any other way to argue that it isn't completely accurate, that it's certainly by the end, he just wasn't familiar with the details of it because he didn't write it. He didn't know. He was asked a question in there that his 8-minute speech that he gave before his testimony about what he was going to say and so on. He was asked by one of the Republicans, who wrote that speech for you? He goes, oh, I'm not going to comment on that. And the Republican said, that's what I thought. You didn't write it, which, that was it. He was reading stuff that he was given to read. And what was in the report was prepared by somebody else. So again, I sort of repeat, I think probably his best defense on all this stuff was, yeah, I was a figurehead. I was starting to lose it. I don't know my own name now. So I really don't think he's going to get in too much trouble because I think that's just the state he's in.
You said that He went to President Trump and asked to be the FBI director again. And of course, President Trump said, no way. So then plan B was to become special counsel. But does he volunteer to be special counsel or does someone appoint him? And how does that work?
Yeah, Rod Rosenstein, I believe he was acting DOJ at that moment. Or maybe what it was Sessions had recused himself. And so Rod Rosenstein, as the deputy, made the appointment. And that's how he was put in there. But now that, again, I mean, the way Washington works, no surprises here, I don't believe, for anyone, but it's not super efficient where things just happen at the snap of the fingers. All these things have been discussed beforehand. And Rod Rosenstein would have known that Mueller was going to go talk to President Trump first. All that was set up in advance. They had been in discussions for at least probably 2 weeks over Mueller being the individual to be appointed. Because if you got to call him in and interview him and talk about it, would you take it? Those sorts of things. So it would have been under discussion. And Mueller would not have gone to the president to ask to be made director of the FBI without telling Rod Rosenstein first. And they would had almost certainly agreed that if that doesn't work, then accept this position. And both said, yeah, shook hands, and he went off to see the president to see what would happen.
Why, in your opinion, would Rod Rosenstein have this little handshake with Mueller to make him special counsel, knowing what he knew about the Uranium One deal?
Well, I don't think the Uranium One deal was taken under consideration because they would have viewed that as a historical non-entity, nothing burger. Nobody's ever looked at again. So I don't think that was ever taken into consideration in any way. I think from Rosenstein's position, looking at Mueller was the perfect guy because Mueller was supposedly had this sterling reputation and unimpeachable character and was a Republican to boot. And, he had all this long list of stuff with his accomplishments, just unimpeachable character that could stand up and run this thing and make sure that it was all fair and even-handed, trying to make that presentation. I don't believe that stuff is true, but I think that was their perspective and Rod Rosenstein's perspective of what he wanted to do. Now, of course, behind the scenes, Mueller's a very liberal guy, was on board with Hillary and with President Obama and very anti-Trump, and everybody he hired was anti-Trump, and all of the people that came over were from the that initial investigation, the Spygate stuff, trying to pin this Russian collusion thing on the president, which they all knew was false. And yet then they all moved over to the special counsel's office. So he was aware of all of those things, and Rosenstein was aware of all those things. So, I mean, the truth is it was a setup. It was a con job. It was, in essence, an attempt to unseat a duly elected president of the United States.
So Brad doesn't think Robert Mueller has too much to worry about, despite the fact that he helped give Russia control over 20% of the country's uranium.
Yeah, he says Mueller is going out as a disgrace already, so he'll get a free pass. But Brad thinks he has Alzheimer's.
What about the Attorney General's recent decision to reinstate the federal death penalty? Who should be worried about that?
The fact that Attorney General Barr announced this news the day after Mueller testified is quite telling. Brad says it was done intentionally, and here's why he said that.
One of the things that I found extraordinarily interesting, really fascinating to me, was the day after the Mueller testimony ended, Attorney General Barr reinstated the death penalty for federal cases. Now, I find that timing, these things don't happen by accident. Everybody decides when they're going to do these announcements. Everybody. You want to bury it. We've all heard this discussed. You want to bury a news item, put it out Friday afternoon. You want to get it into the news cycle, come out Tuesday morning or earlier in the week so that they have all week to munch on it in the press. So the fact that he made this announcement immediately after the Mueller testimony ended, I think links those two things. So look at this too. Now, if that's the case, so the Mueller investigation is completely destroyed. It has concluded at least one thing clearly, and that is that there was no Russian collusion. So nothing else can come out of that because the basis didn't exist of the collusion with the Russians. That's all over. So then you have to go back and look at the beginning of the investigation. How did all this come to be? And A.G. Barr has said in interviews, I asked the director of the FBI, what's the origin of this thing? Why did this go when all this stuff out here turns out to be crap? And I did not receive a satisfactory answer. And that's his quote. I did not receive a satisfactory answer. Now, for A.G. Barr to say that, I mean, that's very conclusive and clear. So he's not happy with what he saw, and that's when he appoints John Durham, who's done this sort of stuff before, going and look at all of this. So A.G. Barr's hot after this. He sees all this as a problem. He's not getting satisfactory answers. So what's the conclusion? The only thing you can conclude is it's political. If it's political, that means there was treason. You had an attempt to overthrow the President of the United States using these underhanded means for pure political motives. There was no legal basis to do any of those things you do. So treason, if there is a federal death penalty in existence, carries that penalty. So now, if you were an attorney general and you had to go down and sit in front of any of these guys, let's start with Peter Strzok, just because he was so deeply and intimately involved, and we've all seen from his text exchanges with his girlfriend what his leanings were on this, pure political motives. Let's just think Attorney General Barr sits down with Strzok and goes, listen, my friend, you're guilty as hell. You're guilty as hell. Now, you tell me everything about all the people above you who are involved, and I'll take the death penalty off the table. Or we go forward in court and you take your chance, my friend, with dying on the chair given a lethal injection. So which is it? How do you want to play this out? And there's not a one of those guys that's not going to sing. There's not a one of them that won't flip and tell everything they know. So, I mean, they just have to get to the right level of person. Now, I don't know that that's Strzok. Strzok's probably would be one of the primary targets. So you want to go one level below him, but go to whoever that is and say, you're part of a treasonous act. Death penalty's on the table. What do you say? You want to convert? We'll give you, flip. We'll give you 10 years. Tell us everything you know about all those guys. And that's just such a strong position to negotiate from. I mean, like I said, there's none of those guys that are going to be able to stand up under that pressure. Not a one of them. They're just not built for that. These aren't street people. These are white-collar executive type workers. They've never really, maybe early in their career in the FBI did a few things, but prosecutors have been lawyers all their lives. They're sitting in offices, have secretaries and talking to judges and all of that. Most of these FBI guys, aren't really the street beat kinds of guys. They're white-collar crimes and sitting in an office, a cubicle mainly if you're at the FBI, but sitting in these offices doing these jobs. They're not street operator types of guys for the most part, and I don't think any of those guys are. I'm not suggesting I would be, able to stand up under that pressure either. I don't think many people would, which is the point out of this. If they look at you and say, I'm going for the death penalty on you, my friend, or tell me everything you know, I think they would tell them all everything they know. So I just find that those timing things are on purpose. They always are. So I think Barr was drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, we're going forward with the investigation. By the way, death penalty is now being reinstated. So if you're guilty of treason, you got some problems.
So speaking of treason, there have been reports or there have been, discussions in different various places, either in other alternative news sites or on Twitter or Facebook, that all of this really goes back to Hillary Clinton and something that she might have done. That it didn't originate in trying to get rid of President Trump, but it really originated in some of her dealings, like the Uranium One Deal, and then it connects to the emails that you have talked about in the past. And that because of these problems, she needed to find a way to take the attention off of herself and the Democratic Party. And so they cooked up this idea to put all the focus on President Trump and his campaign and on him. Is there any truth to that in your mind, or have you come to the same conclusion?
I do believe it's true. I think that this originated from Hillary Clinton. I believe that is correct, because if you look at the timing of all of this stuff, all of this, the collusion investigation and all of those things took place, or began, I should say, long before Trump was the nominee even, yet alone president. So what existed in that earlier timing that was such an issue, kind of working it backwards to see, if all this was done on purpose, which it clearly now is done on purpose for political motives, what problem would it have solved? And so I think if you look at what was going on at that time, there's one issue that stands alone, and that is those initial WikiLeaks. And those were all of Hillary Clinton's emails that had classified information on them. Now, she did this to herself. It was a self-inflicted wound because she had these personal servers and had all of this classified information on personal servers that didn't have the protection to withstand these attacks from China. According to Louis Gohmert's office, it was the Chinese that grabbed all this stuff that got it to the foreign powers. So she had all of this information out there that ended up at WikiLeaks, so therefore the cat was out of the bag. So what do you do to cover that, to misdirect and take the pressure off yourself? So you got to find a scapegoat. You got to find somebody to blame for those things being taken and given to WikiLeaks, where now people can read them. Now, very quickly on how those got there, those documents, every one of those documents, they have to be the classified computer system at her office at State Department, and she had one at home too, is completely separate system. There's no thumb drive that you can put in there to take copies off and all that. You can print stuff, otherwise you read it on the screen. So every one of those classified documents had to be printed off on her classified computer system. The header and footer were cut off that shows all the classifications. And then you had to scan the body of it that was left, that was the meat of the cable or whatever it was, intel report that they were looking at. And then that was on an unclassified system from the moment it was scanned. And then it was put into her emails and sent to her in her emails so she could read it on that BlackBerry. And we've all seen the pictures of her looking at her traffic on that. So that's how and why all that had to be done. So all of those things on this computer system at home that got ripped off end up at WikiLeaks. So she had to figure out a way to cover up. So she had to find somebody to blame. So I think they set all of this in motion using the FBI and the CIA to set all these pieces out there in motion. Both of them would have been a natural fit. The intelligence part of the FBI, the CI division, and the CIA, also intelligence, so that they could then use those people to those organizations to point the finger at the Russians, because they knew it was the Chinese. So they had to blame somebody that was not the Chinese. They had to find somebody else. So the only person really left that made any sense was the Russians. So they blame the Russians because then there's no evidence, it's nebulous and all of that, and they can just say, oh, well, we have to find all this stuff that Trump has. And I'm sure that what they were expecting was that they would start digging in, and Trump must have done something wrong somewhere, and we'll find something to blame him for that was illegal, because all of them think that way and do stuff like that. So they couldn't believe that it would be possible to go through all this stuff and not be able to pin something on Trump. And they went to incredible extremes, like going back after Manafort, who's not a white knight riding in on his horse sort of guy. And they were able to pin a few things on him. All of this done to try and pressure these people into providing anything on Trump, which just never existed. So they didn't have anything to provide. Trump's former lawyer, all of these people, it was all the same tactic. Come down hard, try to get him to flip and see what we can get on Trump. Now, one other little aspect of that worth mentioning is Seth Rich, because probably WikiLeaks, the actual source of all of that stuff, was leaked by Seth Rich. Now, that was kind of semi-confirmed by WikiLeaks when the head of WikiLeaks publicly stated that he wanted to offer a reward for information on whoever murdered Seth Rich. Now, Seth Rich was shot in the back of the head in Washington, D.C. He was not robbed. He had an expensive watch in his wallet. All that was left. So he was just assassinated in Washington, D.C. Odd. So WikiLeaks founder Assange was offering this reward, which I think it was $30,000, $40,000. It was a fairly sizable amount of money. And then he was asked, well, is that Seth Rich the source of of the WikiLeaks information on Hillary Clinton's emails? He goes, no, I never comment on that sort of stuff. He wasn't. And they said, well, then why are you doing the reward? He says, well, because I forget how he phrased it exactly, but the essence of it was that because we want to have revenge for our sources. So in a backhanded way, he confirmed that Seth Rich was the source of all this stuff that went to WikiLeaks. But, from Hillary Clinton's perspective, it was awfully convenient that that source was dead. I'm not saying she ordered it done or anything, but it was a very convenient coincidence for Hillary Clinton to have had that guy die, which everyone, I guess that gets off into conspiracy theory stuff, but it was awfully helpful to have that happen. So at any rate, no matter where the source of this stuff was, it was still out there. Hillary Clinton had a terrible problem because of all these classified documents that were on that. So she had to come up with a solution. And I think that is what drove the bus. And so from there, you have to blame the Republicans. Who else can you blame? And you really have to blame the Russians because who else makes sense under the circumstances? So that was what they started doing. And then they started setting up from the very beginning these people like Papadopoulos and Mifsud from the Italians, all of this sort of stuff to draw in anything they could to create smoke in relation to the Russians, because all of that had to be lined up well in advance before Trump won. So they were trying to show some of this someplace. And then once he became the candidate, then it was full bore on trying to show that there was Trump collusion. So all of these things led to the next stage of it. And I think the origin was the WikiLeaks documents, and it was pushed by this group of people. And they all, again, remember, everybody thought until about 8 o'clock election night that Hillary was going to be president. And so it would have been very easy under those circumstances to prove collusion with Trump. But once he won, that created real problems because they had to have a paper trail in order to do this. And the law system, the legal system, the FBI always has good paper trails. So that stuff is still there. And now it bites them in the rear end because that paper trail, it's hard to destroy all of that and all the people that were involved. They've got real problems. That's why I think John Durham, maybe a month ago, was supposed to be done with his investigation. And instead, he rented new office space and hired new attorneys. So his investigation is expanding, not wrapping up. So I think just the huge amounts of material that he's coming across has surprised everybody.
In terms of the death penalty, you've mentioned different times about Mueller probably has a defense because now he's feeble and they probably won't go after him. Do you have any thoughts on who should be afraid or concerned about the reinstitution of the death penalty?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think if you're looking at this and just try to step back and say who had to be involved in all of this to put it together, it could not have been done without Jim Comey, then director of the FBI. Couldn't have been done without John Brennan, then director of the CIA. I think we all can pretty safely conclude Peter Strzok was involved as head of the CI division, the counterintelligence division of the FBI. It's hard to not have those three at least considered to be high on the list of targets for any sort of investigation. In that, you'd have to, I think, probably include Jim Clapper, and then you start going down the chain within those organizations. And I think there's probably 4 more senior FBI officials, 2 or 3 senior DOJ officials. I would take a close look at Rod Rosenstein. I think he's got some problems because he had to sign that FISA request too. So there's some problems there for him out of that. And then at the CIA, I think the same thing. Now, Gina Haspel, the current director of the CIA, was chief of station in London during the period of time when all of this was taking place, and a lot of this was coordinated through England. And Peter Strzok was traveling to London and coordinating some of these things, apparently. So a lot of reporting on that as well. So it would have been hard for the chief of station not to have been involved. So there's a lot of talk about her being looked at as well. And I think she's, shown that she intends to resist because, her answer was, oh, yeah, we'll cooperate, but we're going to protect sources and methods. Well, that's kind of a standard thing to say, but, knowing that this whole fiasco of investigating Russian collusion, that there was no intelligence involved with it, what sources and methods are you protecting? Why would that be your answer? If you're using your contacts overseas for illegal purposes, nothing to do with intelligence, there are no sources and methods. You could argue some methods perhaps, but that's just not going to hold up. There's just too much lined up against you if that's the case. I wouldn't be surprised if Gina Haspel were being looked at closely. And like I said, Rod Rosenstein, 2 or 3 people in DOJ, the FBI, and CIA. I think that's where John Durham is spending all of his time. And I think John Durham has found a lot more there than he ever dreamed he would. And that's why he's expanded his investigation. I personally think, if nothing else, I think the FISA thing is going to have a lot of people in trouble.
Well, it's no surprise that Brad would name the players involved in the Russia collusion investigation. And as he said before, everything is timed. Arleen, thanks for another interesting interview with Brad Johnson.
You're welcome.
This has been America Daily. Please join us next Thursday when Brad Johnson talks to Arleen about the 4+1 strategic threats the U.S. is facing. I'm Mark Jackson. Thank you for listening.